Architectural Artcast.
Why do 99% of all movies coming out of Hollywood stink? Well, I'd argue all the arts stink, but we're just going to stick with movies for the time being. It's not the first time in Hollywood's history that they've put idiots and loons like Favreau, Kennedy, and Feige in charge. And Amazon, Netflix, and Disney, they're not the first corporations to have ever put their grubby fingers into Hollywood. And propaganda and the message, they've been a part of Hollywood since time immemorial. If you don't think there's messaging in for a fistful of dollars, I got a bridge to sell you. I'm going to make the argument that this is the natural outcome of what happens when you spent the last 40 years systematically driving the middle class out of anything to do with the arts. Gary Beekler from Nerdrotic and others are on the right track when they point out, rightfully so, that the American right abandoned culture, and in doing so, they abandoned the arts. But the American right wasn't acting in a vacuum. The art institutions from top to bottom, education, creation, distribution, and critique of the arts, systematically drove the right out of anything to do with the arts. But the right wasn't their real target. What they were trying to do was purge the arts of anything to do with the middle class. More importantly, they wanted to get rid of the middle class's value system, the Jacksonian tradition. I have another video. That's just fun to say. But I have another video that goes into a brief history of the Jacksonian tradition here in America. I'll link it in the description down below for those who might be interested. But for our purposes today, the Jacksonian tradition is not a political movement. It doesn't have any leaders. It doesn't even have an official rule book. It's what philosophers like to call a folkway. Shared attitudes and values among a community. In our case, the American middle class. And the four core tenets of this community are individualism, self-reliance, equality, and personal courage. Do those values sound familiar? They should, because that's pure Americana. They're the foundation of an incredibly wide range of movies. Shane, Casablanca, Die Hard, just to name a few. So why is Hollywood so anxious to purge itself of these values? Well, to understand that, we have to go back and look at the history of art in America, particularly the second half of the 19th century. Historically, there have been two types of artists, the working artists and then the ones I like to call the dilettantes. The working artists made a living off of the creation and sale of their art. Here in the West, since the Italian Renaissance, they have been firmly entrenched in the middle class. They help define culture and how our civilization has seen itself for the last 500 years. The dilettantes, on the other hand, came from the aristocracy, the elite, and the wealthy. They used art to show off their class and culture and social position. The dilettantes' art has always been derivative. They like to abstract the techniques of the working artist and then move them into a new context. A painting technique the working artist might use to decorate a pot, the dilettante would use to paint on paper or parchment, or later, canvas. There have always been tensions between the two groups. My art is better than your art. Nuh-uh. But in most cases, their relationship was pretty symbiotic. The dilettantes depended upon the working artists for their styles and techniques. Like I said, the dilettantes' art is derivative. But the working artists, they didn't want to piss off their best customers and potential patrons. In the Western tradition, particularly after the Italian Renaissance, if you wanted to become a working artist, you were apprenticed under a master. After a certain amount of time, and when you had shown a level of competence in your tasks, your master would give you a piece of paper declaring you a journeyman, where you would then go out, seek your own clients, and hope to gain enough fame and reputation where you could become a master, open your own school, have your own students, and thus the cycle would repeat itself. Now, if you were a dilettante, you were either self-taught or you hired one of those masters to come to your home and tutor you individually. In England during the 17th and 18th centuries, it became fashionable for young aristocrats to do what they called the Grand Tour, to go visit the ruins of the ancients and the works of the masters in person. Greece and Italy became popular stops on this trip. But not everybody had the time, the money, and the wherewithal. Let's face it, a lot of these young aristocrats were lazy SOBs to spend up to 5 years on these trips. So the universities started offering art history classes. You could learn all about those stinky old ruins and the works of those crazy dead guys and still have time to go visit your mistress in the afternoon. It wasn't long before those universities that offered art history classes opened their own art schools. But for the next couple hundred years, those diplomas weren't worth the paper they were written on. They lacked legitimacy. If you wanted to be a real working artist, you went and studied under a master, like it had always been done. At the beginning of the 19th century, American universities decided they wanted to legitimize their art schools. Their solution was very simple. They just bought out the traditional art schools, brought their masters into their programs as professors, used the masters' reputations to legitimize the university art schools. But this fundamentally shook up the universities. You got to remember, at this time, universities were the domain of the wealthy. For the first time in history, at least in these art schools, a large percentage of the student body were coming from the middle class. After the American Civil War, the university art schools became the dominant system. It also became fashionable for wealthy families to send their children to these art schools. First time in history, you had working artists and dilettantes studying art together, being taught by the same people. Now, there were still tensions between the two groups. My art's the real art. Nuh-uh. But by and large, the two groups got along. These wealthy families, they were also patrons of the arts. Their children in these schools, they were talent scouts. These families could gain a lot of prestige by finding some diamond in the rough, promoting their careers. And the working artists, the middle class artists, their careers could be made by finding the right patron. The two groups may have gotten along well, but their goals were very different. The middle class art students, they wanted to use their art to get a job, make enough money to be able to support a family. The wealthy students, this was the Gilded Age. You had families amassing wealth on a level that hadn't been seen since Roman times. These families were anxious to show off their status and social position, so they turned to an old classic, art. These wealthy families were after prestige by showing that they could afford to send their children to art school, and then later continued to support them as they pursued an interest in the arts. Art wasn't a profession for them. It was a full-time hobby. In fact, they could lose that prestige that they were so anxious to get by making money off of their art, because now it had just become a job. These gentle artists were interested in fame. They wanted the attention of the art world and praise from their peers. The currency they traded in were accolades and awards, and they sought to have their work displayed in the galleries and museums of New York, Paris, and London. In the 1890s, everything changed when a particularly nasty variant of Marxism swept through American universities. They hid by a lot of different names: American Pragmatism, the Chicago School, but you probably know them by their political name, early 20th century American Progressivism. When they got into the art schools, they did the two things that progressives do oh so well. They changed the definition, and they lied through their teeth. Let me tell you all the dirty little secret of Marxism. It has never been accepted by the working and middle classes. But there is one group who has consistently embraced Marxism: the wealthy. So the Marxists might have gone through the American university system like a hot knife through butter, but when they got to the art schools, they faced resistance. In fact, they were met with open hostility. The middle-class art students and the middle-class professors wanted nothing to do with what Marxism was selling. The elite professors and wealthy students, they might have been sympathetic, but peer pressure is a powerful thing. So at first, they resisted as well. The first thing the progressives did was introduce their new definition of art. Art could no longer serve a purpose or function. It had to exist for its own sake. And more importantly, it had to exist outside of the economic system. And then they introduced a new hierarchy. At the top, fine art. Below that, primitive art. And then below that, craft. This definition and hierarchies served multiple purposes. Those middle-class students looking to make a living off of their art, they're not artists anymore. And the arts that they tended to gravitate towards, like pottery, it's no longer an art either. It's just craft. And anybody who happened to have studied under one of the masters in one of the more traditional schools, they didn't learn art either. They learned primitive art. And those old masters who had given the university art schools their legitimacy, they're not artists either. They're primitive artists. And it just so happens that the only art that was reclassified as fine art were the derivative abstracted arts that the wealthy students were interested in. The one group who had no interest in making money off of their art to begin with. In one fell swoop, the progressives were trying to turn the art world from a profession into a hobby that only the wealthy could afford to participate in. The progressives' new hierarchy system also performed another important function, gatekeeping. Seeing as how they were the ones who determined what was and wasn't art, they got to determine who came into the art world and who didn't. And their criteria? The usual, race, ethnicity, disability, sometimes religion, the usual. The second thing the progressives did was approach the wealthy art students and lie through their teeth. They told them, you know how you're not interested in making money off your art? That means your art is pure. And that makes you a morally superior human being because you've already stepped outside of economics. You're a part of the avant-garde who's leading humanity towards the socialist utopia. When it comes to lying, it's in for a penny, in for a pound. Because next, the progressives told the wealthy art students, those middle-class students? They don't create culture. They don't create real art. You do. It's the wealthy in society who create culture and who create legitimate art. The middle class, they're just jealous and resentful of you. They want to get rid of you, replace you. But all they're capable of doing is producing cheap imitation knockoffs of your culture. And the wealthy art students, they ate this argument up with a spoon. This kicked off a 100-year-plus war for the control of the art world. Why were the progressives so hostile to the American middle class, and more importantly, their Jacksonian value systems? Well, their attitude can be best summed up in a quote from Susan Sontag, author, critic, and devout Marxist. She bemoaned, "We'll never turn America into a communist nation unless we get rid of the Midwest work ethic." It wasn't the Midwest work ethic itself that bothered the progressives. It was the underlying values that drives it. Individualism, self-reliance, equality, and personal courage. 4 ideas that are diametrically opposed to collectivism, socialism in general. You have to undermine, get rid of them if you have any chance for socialist ideas to take hold within the culture. In the 1920s and 30s, the progressives just didn't control the art world. They controlled the majority of American institutions. And they were rubbing their hands with glee because they thought they were going to get to witness the death of Jacksonian America once and for all. We had massive immigration from Eastern Europe and other places. People were coming from cultures with much more of a collectivist socialist worldview. Just overwhelmed the Jacksonians. Changed the culture from without. The art world, they didn't want to miss out on the action either. Hollywood was producing movies with clear-cut Marxist communist messaging. Birth of a Nation. You get past its vile racism and look at its other messaging, it's straight up communism. Music industry, they wanted in too. They created a whole new genre, folk music. Wrap Marxist communist ideas in catchy all-American jingles with traditional music arrangements. This land is your land. This land is my land. Sorry to subject you to that. But something funny happened on the way to the forum. Well, two things happened. First, World War II happened. And by the end of the war, American progressivism had been completely delegitimized. Hitler, Stalin. But the second thing that happened was Jacksonian values themselves. Individualism, self-reliance, equality, and personal courage. These ideas are powerful and seductive. Those immigrants who were supposed to overwhelm the culture, by the end of the war, they were abandoning their own culture's value systems and embracing Jacksonian values. I can give you one example of how powerful these ideas can be. My father-in-law grew up in 1950s South Korea. He told me that his dream as a little boy was to run off to Texas and become a cowboy. Another important factor was after the war, universities themselves changed. The GI Bill. First time in history, you had middle-class students coming into the universities in large numbers across the board, all areas, all departments. The progressives had to keep their heads down. And it wasn't until the late 60s and into the 70s that they reemerged, started gaining dominance in the arts and in Hollywood, started putting their messaging back into their movies and music. But then they got hit upside the head by the 80s and 90s. It was in the 1980s that the progressives realized as long as they had the middle class in the arts, they were always going to have a problem because the middle class would continue to promote Jacksonian values and they were just too powerful, too seductive. There would always be a struggle for control. So they began to systematically purge the middle class from anything to do with the arts. That's when you saw art programs being cut from public high schools. Sorry, folks, we just don't have the budget for that sort of thing. Although we still have the budget for that sort of thing in the wealthy neighborhoods, but middle class and poor neighborhoods, forget about it. But don't worry, we will open up specialized art schools where you can come if you have talent, which we will determine, gatekeep, so we can make sure only the right people come into the arts. Anybody with questionable values or attitudes, you don't even need to bother to apply. Once you've cut off the next generation, now you just have to deal with who's already there. Those who are too powerful, too well entrenched, you leave them alone. They'll age out eventually. At some point, they'll all be gone. Everybody else, you do what you need to get them to leave, whatever it takes. And we all know how this is going to end. Last 20 years, the product out of Hollywood has been on a consistent decline. This is due to the fact that those who knew what they were doing, had artistic ability, talent, and drive, they've aged out. Hollywood has no one to replace them because it's now just filled with wealthy progressives, people who are only capable of producing derivative art. I keep hearing people, some of them I respect, asking the same question here on YouTube. Well, why doesn't Hollywood go back to making movies that audiences actually want to watch? Make movies that make money. Stop chasing after the ever-elusive modern audience. Well, there are a couple of reasons. First and foremost, they're not capable of making those movies anymore. They don't have the people with the background and experience to know how to tell those stories. And even if Hollywood said, oops, we screwed up, we need to change course, before we would see results, it would be at a minimum 20 years. You would have to start teaching people now, and then those people would then have to start teaching the next generation before we began to see results. And those institutions, they would fight it the whole way. School teachers, they wouldn't want their students to start using Jacksonian values in their art. College professors definitely wouldn't. And in Hollywood, do you think the activists would allow that to come back in? Not a chance. The second problem we have is a clash in values and attitudes. You're assuming that they want to make money. You don't understand. You're expressing one of those icky Jacksonian values that they so despise. They want to live outside of economics. Their goal is praise from their peers, awards, and accolades. But you say, but they'll go out of business if they don't make money. That's what sugar daddy corporations are for, to support their hobby. And as long as they find somebody else to foot the bill, they're going to keep on keeping on. And the third problem I've already hinted at. We're dealing with true believers. They're on a mission. They want to destroy the American middle class. And they would rather let Hollywood burn to the ground before they would make a movie or any type of art that promotes or glorifies anything to do with Jacksonian values. Hollywood as we know it is done. Sad thing is, it's been gone a long time. We're just now seeing its death throes. But it's symbolic of a much bigger problem, because art as we know it is also done. It's also died a long time ago. Progressives, be careful what you wish for. You may have succeeded in driving the American middle class and its values out of all the arts, but in doing so, you killed Hollywood as well as all the other arts. And art education, art institutions, they're dead as well. But nature abhors a vacuum. The American middle class, they still have the same drive for self-expression, to create, to make art. But now they're able to do it outside of the institutions, outside of the gatekeeping. Developments in technology have made art accessible to more people than ever before in history. We're seeing an explosion in creativity, a renaissance. We have the Iron Age, Rippaverse, Will Jordan's project, just to name a few. Hollywood's not going to change. They're not going to suddenly see the light. They will continue to make movies that stink until they're irrelevant and no one cares. But the good news, somebody else will come along and they'll make a movie that audiences actually want to go see. Well, at any rate, I hope I've given you all something to think about. And until next time, y'all be safe. Oh yeah, please like and subscribe, and leaving a comment would be helpful as well.
Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment.